MomoCon's guest today. We have John, Total Biscuit, and I forgot his last name. Everybody hate me now. Go ahead. Okay, stop. Everybody love him!
Bane, yes. Hi, everybody. How are you doing today? Awesome. Wonderful to hear that. Well, we have a very interesting panel which has no moderator whatsoever because she's stuck in traffic. So I showed up expecting to be asked questions by a moderator and then, of course, doing Q&A later. We're not going to do that because we don't have one. So that's great, but we'll see how it goes. Thank you very much for everyone showing up. This is my first time at MomoCon. Not usually the sort of convention that we see like a huge number of big kind of gaming YouTubers or whatever. I know you guys have a huge League of Legends scene based on the fact that about half of the people in the crowd are in League cosplay of some form, so that seems to be a big thing. Well, this is our first time here. We showed up to DragonCon last year, which was extremely intimidating. I assume almost everybody in this room has been to DragonCon at some point, right? Yeah. How do you survive that convention?
Blood sacrifice.
Right, yeah, that was the first mistake we made, not having enough alcohol. Yeah, that convention is terrifying. Like, the idea that a convention could take over an entire city in the way that it does. I mean, I assume the local residents just go and hide until everything's over, right? There's a bunker system, something along those lines, rations are handed out, yeah. Okay, that makes perfect sense. But this is a cool little event. Very awesome to get to show up and do a panel for whatever reason. As I said, I'll be doing Q&A towards the end of the show. I think we have one mic there and one mic there. If the moderator doesn't show up, it'll start sooner rather than later, I can guarantee. But we will see how that goes. For those who don't know who I am, my name is John Bain. I also known online as Total Biscuit or Cynical Brit. I run a YouTube channel, well, I run a couple of them. And primarily it's about gaming critique on PC. So my job is to tell you whether or not a game is any good. Hopefully, I'll get it right, usually, most of the time. And I also occasionally do Twitch streaming and things like that. And it looks like either that's a moderator or a random person wandering on stage. Let's find out. Hi.
Hey everyone, I'm Diz. I'll be your moderator tonight.
Welcome to the show.
Sorry I'm late. Okay, so how's everyone enjoying MomoCon so far? Good? Awesome, yeah. Hopefully you didn't have to stay in the traffic like I did. But, so my name's Diz. I'm a senior at KSU, and I major in computer game design and development. And as you know, we're lucky to have the chance to talk to John Bain, also known as Total Biscuit, the Cynical Brit. So let's all give him a big round of applause for being here today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be out here.
So he's best known as being a prominent British esports commentator as well as YouTube's #1 PC gaming critic. So can you go a little more in depth about what you do for those who don't know?
Well, for those who don't know, I generally look at games on PC and try to figure out whether or not they're worthy of your time and attention. And when it comes to, I suppose, being #1 PC gaming critic, I've always thought it helps to be, king of a niche that is so niche that nobody else competes with you. I think that makes it really easy to end up being #1 in it. But we've been working on the channel as sort of focused on PC game critique probably for about 5 years. Started doing initially World of Warcraft material, and then moved away from that and started to look at indie games as well as AAAs, and eventually grew to the point where quite a lot of people seem, for whatever reason, to rely on us for buyer's advice. I think is probably the best way to describe it.
Awesome, yeah. So something that you don't get to talk to as often is that you used to host a metal radio show?
Yeah, that was a while ago. You've done your research, no doubt. Yeah, let's see. How far do we go back to that? Because there was the time when we were doing pirate radio to about 25 people at 3 o'clock in the morning. There was the time when we were doing student radio at 3 o'clock in the morning on this giant hut on stilts, which was basically to the point of becoming a condemned building. It was the old student radio station, I use that term very loosely, which was a box on stilts. Just I don't know why. I don't know why they thought this was a good idea. I guess it's the only way they could isolate the studio from everything else. You went into this thing and it looked like it was straight out of the 1970s. There were cobwebs everywhere, really old kit, everything was analog. I had to copy all of my stuff onto tapes so that I could actually play it because they didn't have proper CD players in that thing. They were using mostly old reject BBC equipment that they'd taken from, I don't know, they probably stole it, let's be honest. They thieved it. I think that's probably quite likely, and every time we did that show, we were terrified that a strong breeze would blow the studio over, and that we'd all just die in this horrendous accident. But it didn't, thankfully, so that was great. But I got to do metal, mostly European, sort of a little bit more obscure metal on student radio for years, and took that also online as well, and that ended up with me doing a show on a little fan site that had started in 2004 called Wow Radio, and I ended up being a metal DJ there initially. Oh great, we have one fan, phenomenal. Someone listen to that. I'm sorry, I'm so very sorry that you had to put up with that nonsense. But eventually the guy asked me, the guy who was running it at the time, do you want to do a talk show? And can I? I don't know. Can I? Can I talk for 2 hours about World of Warcraft every week? Apparently. And that's sort of where everything got going from an amateur standpoint, and eventually, after years and years and years, that ended up becoming a career.
Awesome. Yeah, so you don't just have a passion for metal music, but you also have a huge passion for original video game soundtracks, as you stated in your videos like the Arbitrary Game Awards.
Right, did you actually get through all of that?
I love those videos.
That's over 2 hours. Impressive. All right.
So what are some recent soundtracks from games this year that you've been listening to a lot?
Well, at the moment, I can't stop listening to the soundtrack to Doom, which is absolutely phenomenally good. So the guy behind that is a guy called Mick Gordon. He is someone that really loves down-tuned guitars and was also responsible for redoing the soundtrack to a game called Killer Instinct, which, again, I imagine some people are also quite familiar with. That soundtrack was amazing. A Doom soundtrack, it's like, well, how do you improve on something which is like a sacred cow when it comes to game soundtracks? You know, everyone remembers E1M1, everybody remembers the Doom soundtrack. It was mostly lifted from older metal songs. You know, it was, I wouldn't say parodies of tracks from Pantera and Metallica and Maiden and so on and so forth, but there were definitely a lot of metal influences in that soundtrack. And then Mick Gordon's like, well, you know, okay, we can take the older music and we can down-tune everything. We can add a little bit of industrial synth into it. We can make it really dirty, grimy, and heavy. And if you play Doom, I think it's within about 5 seconds of starting the game, you pick up a gun, you start murdering demons with it, and the metal kicks in, and that's it. That's just absolutely phenomenal. So I've been digging that a great deal lately. And I can't stop listening to Undertale remixes for some reason. I don't exactly know why. I think it's one of those weird situations where you've got a soundtrack that could have very easily existed in the Super Nintendo era and become iconic, like, say, the Castlevania soundtrack or the Mega Man soundtrack or any of the Mario soundtracks, because it's written in a way that seems like it's intentionally limited by technology. Back then, of course, you were limited in the number of tracks you could have, the number of instrument pads you could have, and the software that you were using. Now you can make pretty much anything. But what's interesting is that the really timeless stuff, I think, from video game soundtracks comes from eras where they were limited and their creativity was sort of tested in the sense that they only had a limited number of tools to work with. So they came up with stuff that stood the test of time. And Undertale, weirdly enough, has that. And I think that's why it's become such a cultural phenomenon, especially when it comes to its music, and why people just can't stop remixing everything from it.
Right.
And I hope they never do stop remixing everything from it, because it will never not be entertaining.
Yeah, I think a lot of games nowadays, or like DJs themselves, try to do the whole chiptune thing, and it's kind of like over the top. I think they hit it like right on the spot.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think it came in with the revival of the sort of 8-bit retro-inspired platformer nonsense that so they said, well, you know, we're going back to our roots. We're going to make a retro game because no one's ever done that right. And it's like, well, no. Someone might want to tell those people that lots of people have now done that, and we could maybe just hold back on them a little bit. But of course, with that, along has to come a soundtrack. But do you get a composer that really understands just what makes a soundtrack like that great? You know, the Shovel Knight soundtrack is an example of a soundtrack which is at home in the Super Nintendo era in a game that could have been very much at home in the Super Nintendo era. Right. And then you've got all these other guys who's like, well, you know, we've got an 8-bit little platform, which means we can't draw, basically. We've made... This doesn't really have an art style as such. We had a guy in MS Paint, you know, we bought him a pizza at some point, and he made us some art, if you can call it that. And we have chiptunes which sort of fit along with that. But no, for every 100 of those awful games, there's one just phenomenal soundtrack that really sticks out like that.
Awesome. So you're most commonly associated with your brutally honest video game reviews.
Apparently.
Such as your WTF is first impression videos.
Yep.
So what I was wondering was, with your increase of popularity, obviously you've had the chance to meet a lot more developers of games. Has that made it harder for you to be as brutally honest as you have been?
That's an awesome question, because there's the very clear risk of that happening. I think it was a couple of years ago that I received a Christmas gift from one of them, and it was at that point that I had to contact them and say, look, you know, I know this is the problem, right? Because our videos can have a really big impact on the success of an indie title. You know, we don't really shift the bar too much when it comes to AAAs, of course, you know. Battlefront still sold 13 million copies. Anyone here responsible for that at all? No one will admit to it? Great, awesome. Glad to hear that. But when it comes to indie, especially on PC, there are a few channels that can give a really big shove one way or the other to a game. And we can really help raise awareness for something. And developers can be very grateful for that. And of course, their first instinct is often to reach out and say, thank you so much for doing this. I remember a few years ago, there was one that reached out to us and said, if you hadn't done that, at least we think, looking at our stats, we wouldn't be able to pay the mortgage this month, because they simply weren't selling enough copies. Like, he was at real risk of defaulting on his mortgage. We happened to do a video on his game. It got a bit of a push. He sold a few more units. You know, that helped him out. And it's really difficult not to fall into the trap of thinking that, you know, you're there to help these guys out, and you're there to, I suppose, be a safety net for studios that could otherwise put out a game that never gets noticed. And that's unrealistic, because you're only really one channel. You know, you're one person. You can put out a video that's super positive, and it just might not resonate with anybody. You know, people might not, they just might not share your opinion, you know? Everyone seems to hate Battleborn. I love Battleborn. I don't know why everybody hates Battleborn.
Randy Pitchford!
That's a fair reason. It's his fault, yeah. If you want to blame somebody, Randy Pitchford is a fair person to blame. But sometimes I'll come across a game that I really like and that really resonates with me personally, but doesn't resonate with the general audience, maybe because I've played too many goddamn video games. So I end up wanting to play something interesting and original, a little bit different, even if it's janky in some ways, and other people don't want to play that. And ultimately, I don't have to pay for my games, they do, so there's a huge difference in what people think is good value to them and what is to me. So I'm sort of rambling off topic at this point. Your original question was whether or not it makes it difficult. It absolutely does, and we have to try and make sure that there's a clear barrier and there's at least arm's length between us and a developer. If we get an email that says, we're grateful for what you did for us, that's cool, as long as it kind of doesn't go any further than that. And these days, there's a very blurred line when it comes to YouTube coverage and Twitch coverage as to what kind of thing is sponsored by a developer, what's endorsed by a developer, and what's simply, oh, we got hold of your game and we just played it, and we did so completely independently. And it's sometimes very difficult to figure out where that line is. And it is, if you ever intend to get into anything like this, it's very tempting to become friends with the developers, because I think a lot of us in this room can name developers that we admire, that we can name programmers and artists and musicians in this wonderful industry that we idolize. We've come to idolize over the course of decades. Would you be able to objectively cover that person? Like, what if you met that person in real life? What if you met Shigeru Miyamoto, for instance? What would happen? Would you be able to then look at his game and give an honest criticism, or would you just be intimidated by him even being there? So yeah, it's something that's constantly on my mind. It may be too much, actually. I've had comments from people saying, you're a little bit too far into this whole disclosure thing. Like, you disclose when you shouldn't disclose. You're overdoing it. Is it a gimmick? And it's like, I don't think it's a gimmick. I just think it's not worth the risk of falling into a situation where you personally don't realize what your own bias is. And it's so easy to fall into that if you're not careful.
Right. One thing you mentioned in one of your videos was that you were really worried when Disney started getting involved with you.
Yes.
You were
Yeah.
really worried, like, what would tip them off, and you said that they kind of like realized that that's just something they're gonna have to get used to with the whole like YouTube review thing. So I thought that was cool that companies are starting to be more open-minded to that.
Yeah, because I think that it's not just companies that are becoming more open-minded, it's consumers that are becoming more savvy. I think that everybody in this room has probably at some point experienced something online. They've seen a video or they've seen a stream or whatever, and it's rubbed them the wrong way. They felt that there was something a little bit off about it. And that's because native advertising, as it's called, has run wild over the last few years online. And as a kind of backlash to this, consumers have started to get really savvy and try to inform themselves about what is marketing and what is not. The concept of astroturfing, for instance, on forums, on Reddit, on Twitter, where people will literally be paid to say, oh, this game's amazing, you should totally get into it. Why aren't you, on the hype train with the rest of us? You're being left out. It's a very powerful social motivator. But companies are thankfully starting to come around to the fact that this can seriously backfire in a really big way if they don't do things properly. I just hope that they continue to be held to that standard, and I think the only people that can hold them to that standard are users themselves. The people that are willing to look at something and say, you know what, I'm not going to jump on the hype train for whatever latest $1 million trailer you put together. I'm just going to wait. I'm going to read the reviews. I'm going to watch the Twitch streams. I'm going to watch the YouTube videos. I'm going to wait and see how it turns out. I'm going to be patient. And hey, I'm going to save a little bit of money in the process, so it's win-win.
Right. So do you ever feel more inclined to be a little less harsh to indie games than AAA games, since they're personally watching every review pretty much if it's like a smaller game?
I try not to be wherever possible, but the thing about that is that I think there's a big difference between a truly awful indie game and a truly awful AAA. Like, I think there's only so bad a AAA game can get. A lot of people will turn around and they'll say, Call of Duty's terrible. It's like, compared to what, though? Like, compared to the random Unity asset flip nonsense that pops up on Steam every day that's just literally stolen assets from somebody else. It's like, we're going to try and make a zombie game again. It's got crafting in it. It's got survival, and you want it. You want it. And it's 59 cents because, that represents how much value we think this product's worth. It doesn't matter how terrible a AAA game gets, it's never going to be that bad because hundreds of competent people have worked on it versus one person that has no idea what he's doing. So holding AAAs to a higher standard, I think, is reasonable, but you've got to also just take into account the context in which the indie game is released. You're not expecting something that looks like the most incredible game you've ever seen. You're not expecting visuals to blow you away in terms of technology. You might be expecting visuals to blow you away in terms of aesthetic. Think about Supergiant's games, for instance. There we go. I like this audience already. They got some taste. It's good. Nobody bought Battlefront, and you like Supergiant. Great, love it. So you've got games like Bastion, Transistor, and games like Pyre, and you compare that to something like, say, let's throw Crysis out there for the sake of it. Crysis, the best-looking game at the time, most incredible piece of technology. Not actually that great a game. Not an incredible game, but it looked really, really good. You never compare an indie game to Crysis in terms of its visuals, but you would say, well, what's the art direction? What are they trying to achieve? Was Transistor ever attempting to achieve super realism? Was Shovel Knight ever attempting to achieve super realism? No, what Shovel Knight was attempting to achieve was a true retro-style game that looked kind of like Castlevania. It looked like the NES and Super Nintendo games of old. Did it achieve that? Yes, it did. It achieved it incredibly well. And then you judge it on that basis. And you're just trying to take into account the overall intent of the people that created the art, which I think is something that is a little bit lost these days. That people don't look at the intention of the person that created the art. It's why we get a lot of controversy, I think, around a number of different subjects lately, where someone will make an assumption about the developer, and they really didn't intend to send that particular message, but maybe it got sent anyway inadvertently, and the developer wasn't given the benefit of the doubt. I just think that artistic intent is super important to keep a look at, and when you're judging indies versus AAAs, you've got to bear that in mind.
Yeah, definitely. So you stated in your Dawn of VR video that you currently own an Oculus and a Vive, and that VR is certainly not just a gimmick. So do you see yourself frequently using the VR headset as a preferred peripheral for gaming?
It comes down to the amount of support. So who in this audience has used VR in some form so far? A surprising number of people, cool. And how many of them thought it was pretty cool? Most of them. How many of you vomited as a direct result of using it? 1, 2, 3, yeah. So there's a key problem with VR. You can't just translate any random game to VR and expect it to work, because you have to take into account huge numbers of different factors in the way that the user experiences it. And one of those big factors that people rapidly realize is that if you're playing a game on a television or a monitor, you can move your character around with a control stick or with a keyboard and mouse, no problem at all, and you're not going to have any issues, most likely, in terms of motion sickness or anything like that. However, you try doing that in VR, within about 5 minutes, a lot of people are wanting to hurl at that point. So you have suddenly, by realizing that, said, oh, a lot of our traditional ways of making games don't work anymore. We can't just make a first-person shooter and throw it on a VR headset and expect people to be able to play it without significant discomfort. So they've got to redesign how that works. They've got to redesign how the UI works, how it gives information to the player. How much of the screen are you allowed to see? A lot of games restrict the amount you can see, because if they didn't, then the illusion of what's going on screen wouldn't even work anymore. So you've got to take that into account. So there are huge technological hurdles to come across there. There are certain genres where I think that VR works really well. Racing is a prime example. Any game where you're sitting in a cockpit, whether it be a space simulator, a racing game, or anything like that, or even Euro Truck Simulator, or anything like that, is surprisingly popular in VR. People love doing that, and it's comfortable to play too. But those are not the only games that we all play. And if you play a wide variety of games, there are some games where you just can't see VR being useful in any way. At that point, you can say, oh, well, that's kind of a gimmick. And there are some games that are looking to try and take advantage of that fact. There's a virtual reality card game coming out, which is like, right, you're marketing to people that really love the Yu-Gi-Oh cartoon. Obviously, you want people to be able to summon dragons from their hands and things like that. And that sounds like a really cool gimmick in theory. But how long is that gimmick going to last until people are just sick of it, and they just want to go back to a more traditional experience? I could see myself using VR for a lot of different genres, assuming that they support it correctly. I can see myself playing VR exclusive games, although a lot of the stuff that I've played on Vive so far has been very much a cool demonstration of what the technology can do. But simultaneously, do I want to set up a room in which I don't have anything on the floor to trip over, anything to run into, anything hanging from the ceiling that I can smash my head off of, any ceiling fan that I can stick my hand into? Rest in pieces, Cry. Poor Fingers. He'll never be the same again. It's just a case of, I think that if you have to put a lot of effort into setting up your gaming experience, a lot of people are not kind of gonna bother, because you don't come home from work and say, right, I'm gonna get to setting up my VR and spend an hour setting up a room to do some experience or whatever, and it's like, well, that was cool. Or I could have just sat on the couch for a few hours, or sat on my chair for a few hours. That's one of the many, many challenges that VR actually has to overcome. I would love to see myself playing a lot more VR. I don't know how much of that is going to happen with the current nonsense going on between Oculus and Vive. Oculus is currently trying to make itself the villain, it seems, locking down a lot of stuff that they shouldn't be. They're being very anti-consumer in many ways. There aren't a huge number of games coming out for that platform that I think would really sell the system. But I'd love to see myself playing more of it. I think the technology is incredible. But we're in an early adopter phase right now where we're trying to figure out what to do with it.
Right.
And either we're going to figure out what to do with it and it's going to be successful in the long run, or it's going to become the Kinect. Please no.
So, yeah, on that note, with all the different genres there are, what genre has been like the worst VR experience for you?
The worst VR experience so far, oh God. The one with the sharks in it, probably. They have, what they're doing on VR outside of games is a lot of what they call experiences, which are non-interactive for the most part, but they give you things like camera control. And there was one that I did, which I can't remember if it's like called Pacific Rift or something like that, and you went down under the ocean. I thought, this is going to be a really relaxing experience. You know, I've loved the idea of scuba diving, but I've never gone to do it. It's like, hey, that'll be cool. And then, of course, you get deeper and deeper, and things start to get terrifying. And the camera starts to jerk around, and there's this giant shark in your face. It's just like, why did I even do this? You know, what has science wrought that it brings us this terror? That was definitely a bit of a problem for me, and I have found that some games definitely do induce that feeling of motion sickness because they haven't quite got the movement right yet. They don't quite understand how to make camera movement smooth, how to make camera movement organic, how to keep your inner ear balance in particular in place. So I think some of those non-interactive experiences that just take you on a ride because you don't feel that movement. Mm-hmm. You know what's weird? I actually tried that experience on a plane once. I took, there's a thing called Gear VR, which is for the Samsung phones. You just stick your phone in the front of it. You look like an absolute idiot. It's wonderful. You put it on your face, and you're suddenly in, say, a theater or whatever, and that tiny little box that you get put in economy class is no longer a problem because you've got this giant theater on the moon, and you can watch a movie. It's wonderful. And I decided, you know what, I'll try the under the sea VR experience. And then suddenly we hit turbulence. I'm like, this was an awful, awful idea. What? So VR is awesome. It's going to take a long time to mature, I think. I don't think people should be writing it off so quickly, but I don't think people should be jumping on the bandwagon so soon, because let's be honest, this is the first generation of VR headsets. They've got problems. Mm-hmm. Like, they're not perfect. We don't know who's going to win out, as it were. This whole idea that Oculus is trying to restrict stuff to its platform is not consumer friendly. We don't know how many good games are coming out for it. The user base isn't that big yet. You know, I'd say like wait and see on VR, but I think it's going to be a technology that's going to stick around for a while.
Yeah. So as myself being a game programmer and designer, I love watching your videos because I'm really impressed at how in-depth and technical you dissect games, like to the level to. And a lot of people
I'm mostly just talking out of my ass. But
a lot of people, like the general audience, I don't ever hear like that kind of critique. So I was wondering, have you ever like considered going into game development yourself?
It's funny you should ask that. I mean, yeah, there's been a couple of times. I over the last few months in particular, I've had quite a bit of downtime, especially during treatments and things like that for the cancer stuff. And I've had a lot of downtime, so I've been thinking about things. I'm thinking, like, if I were to ever make a game, you know, what would I do? And I did think about it, and I thought, yeah, I've got a pretty cool idea for one, I think. But when it comes to programming, I am utterly hopeless. I used to program BBC Model Basic when I was about 5 or 6 years old. I learned a little bit of that on the BBC microcomputers. As back then, these microcomputers were actually sent out and sold to people in the UK, and there was a series on television that would teach you how to program to a very, very basic degree in Model Basic. And you know, Visual Basic is still around to this day, you know, so it's been around for 30 plus years. But I was awful at it. Just absolutely, totally awful at it. I remember the most complex thing I ever programmed was a quiz game, 20 questions quiz game. And it took me weeks to do this thing. And then I realized that half of my answers were incorrectly spelled. So the only way you could beat it was to incorrectly spell the answers in exactly the same way that I put them in. Oh, no. I was like, oh, I'm never going to be good at this, am I? Like, no, not a chance in hell. I think that it can be easy to slip into this idea that maybe you know how to design a game just because you talk a lot about games. or critique a lot of games. And I'd like to think I've picked up a couple of things along the way, but I mean, I find the whole idea of programming a game and developing a game to be unbelievably intimidating, like to be a terrifying thing, to the point where I have a huge amount of respect for those that do it. The process is massive, and it's something that kind of, I think, holds me back from being overly vicious whenever I criticize anything, because I think that someone has put so much effort and so much time and work into something, that just to tear it to pieces over the course of some random 15-minute YouTube video would just be utterly unfair. And I imagine that if I ever did make a game, oh, that's open season. Wow. That would be interesting to see what would happen there. I can just imagine the hundreds of developers who have maybe not said great things about their games, like, all right, now is our time. And there's just hundreds of videos like, he is terrible, look at this thing. Absolutely awful. So, I mean, I'd love to at some point make something. I would, but I don't think I have the knowledge, I don't think I have the skill, or the time really to learn. And everyone loves the idea of being the ideas man, but the ideas man isn't a real job. So, I'd need to actually be able to do more than just give ideas.
So in my classes a lot, I learn about the core of games and what makes them essentially fun to different types of people. So personally for you, what makes a game fun?
Ooh, it's a very difficult question because it depends on a huge number of different factors. But it often comes down to an enjoyable core gameplay loop. What you are doing on a regular basis in that game has to be enjoyable in and of itself. You can have the best cutscenes, the best story, the best characters, the best writing, the best voice acting, the best music, this incredible finale to your game, and none of that matters if the 12 hours that you put in before that weren't enjoyable. And the way that that's going to become enjoyable is to create an enjoyable core gameplay loop with very interesting game mechanics, with something that you just enjoy doing in and of itself. Like, you could take away everything else. Like, you cut out all the voice acting, take away all the story. Do you still enjoy doing the main thing that the game is asking you to do? Because if the answer is yes, then in my opinion, you've made a good game. And that's why there are games that are just such timeless classics. The idea of running and jumping in Super Mario is never going to get old. That is always going to be a fun mechanic. The idea, I was about to say Sonic, but no, that's,
What about Sonic 06?
Leave. For a while, Sonic had the core gameplay loop down to a T as well. I can remember just being as thrilled as I was, just running through levels and platforming at a high speed and doing the loops and jumping on enemies. That was a really enjoyable core gameplay loop. The rest of it, couldn't care less. But as long as that's fun, as long as the regular activity is fun, a recent example is Doom. Doom is about shooting demons in the face. That's basically all that game is. Its story is frankly irrelevant. It has one, but it realizes that you can make a game that has a simple, enjoyable, simple core gameplay loop, as long as it's compelling and as long as they continually develop that loop over time and they give you new things to do within that loop and they expand the arsenal of weapons that you have access to and the upgrades that you have access to and the enemies that you fight, I don't think a game like that gets boring very easily. So that's what I look for. I look for those core mechanics. I look for something that I can enjoy doing over and over and over again, and everything else is kind of icing on the cake after that.
So what game do you find most consistently coming back to and playing and not getting bored of?
And not getting bored of? Well, that's a tricky one. I get bored of games like surprisingly easily, but there are a couple of different multiplayer games that I'll always come back to at some point that I think will never get old. It's an interesting discussion that's been going on lately over the past year and a half, maybe 2 years, and I think it's because of the rise of so-called AAA multiplayer-only games. These $60 experiences that don't really have a proper single-player mode. And a lot of people have said, that's not good. I'm not going to pay $60 for a game that just has multiplayer. I was like, I can understand where you're coming from, but simultaneously, the games that I've spent the most time on have all been multiplayer-only games. So if you ask me, well, how much would you have paid for Dota 2 if you had to pay for Dota 2? I was like, I look at the number of skins I've bought, and I was like, apparently I paid way too much for Dota 2. But in theory, you know, if I put 1,000 hours or so into Dota 2, I mean, that, or CSGO or anything like that, I mean, you could say, I'd technically pay hundreds for that, right? You know, because I always keep coming back to it. I feel that the multiplayer-only game experience is something that is a different story every time. And it's the essence of competition. And I think that gaming, down to its very core, is a competition, whether it be a competition against another player or a competition against what the programmer has created for you. A competition against the environment, the AI enemies, or one way or the other. And the competition in itself can be a story. And I think every Dota match, every Hearthstone match, every StarCraft match is a different story. Every Street Fighter match, any competitive multiplayer game that you ever play, you're always going to come out of that with something unique that's never happened before, and it's never going to happen again in exactly the same way. So I think the games that I consistently keep coming back to are those, because when I'm done with the session, I'm always left with a unique memory of something that I know I'm never going to get again. And if I go and play it again, I'm going to get something entirely different the next time. So, yeah, I think that's it.
Awesome.
I should really come back to Dota 2, shouldn't I? Should I say that in a room full of League of Legends fans? I don't know if that's safe. I saw some big weapons out there.
So, what is your guilty pleasure game?
Oh, God.
What's your Candy Crush?
Clash Royale.
Oh, God. It used to be Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes. God, that game's terrible. But for some reason I kept playing it. I don't know why. But yeah, I mean, I think it's weird even to call Clash Royale a guilty pleasure game. I think you can only call it that really because the guys that made it were the guys that made Clash of Clans. And I think that most core gamers will turn around and stick their nose up at Clash of Clans while secretly playing Clash of Clans, because that game is ludicrously popular. And mobile gaming has a stigma that it's fairly earned. You know, I think there's a reason why mobile gaming in general has a stigma. It doesn't have to, but a lot of the games that have come out for that platform have been shameless cash vampires. And the only purpose that they serve is to get as much money out of kids and bored housewives as humanly possible. And they do a great job at doing that. But in terms of actually being entertaining games, not so much. I think as annoying as the mobile monetization of something like Clash Royale is, and the way that you can effectively spend infinite money on that game and still lose, it's still at its core a very entertaining game. It's a very strategic game. It's a very fast-paced game. It's got a lot of, I wouldn't say originality to it, but it's got a lot of really solid mechanics, and I enjoy what it does. So I guess you could call that guilty pleasure, but I also buy Call of Duty every year. I don't really know why. I think every time I come back and I'm just thinking, you know, well, so many people play this every year. They obviously get a kick out of it. So I might as well try to find out what that kick is. And I think for a while you do. And then people get better than you, and then you get sick of it and you leave. It's like you find it enjoyable until you can't get kill streaks to drop on people's heads anymore, and then you're like, you know what, okay, I'm done. I'm going to go play something else. So, yeah, at the moment, it's probably games like that, and Hearthstone. Always Hearthstone. That awful game.
So another one of my favorite videos of yours is the 5 words you'd like to see retired from game discussion.
I think you watch more of my videos than I do. That's...
So you included terms like pay to win, cinematic, overrated, roguelike. Are there any more words or commonly used statements that you'd like to add to that list?
Oh, God. How much time you got? I kept that to 5 words, and that was 40 minutes long. I've only got 25 minutes left of this panel. That's, oh, man. Could we please... what was that? Got all day? Oh, we'll see. There are a few words that that are definitely overused. Can we get rid of reskin? There's one. Let's get rid of reskin. So the reason I want rid of reskin is that it encourages an attitude within discussion whereby people make a very shallow assumption as to what a game is and then write it off entirely on the basis of that. It's almost like people forgot what genres were. It's like, we've had the issue with Overwatch lately being, it's a TF2 reskin. It's a reskin? I mean, I remember reskins. I remember playing Quake and we got a reskin. They changed the skins. The game was the same, but they cosmetically changed what the game looked like. Everything else is called a genre. So I'd love to get rid of reskin because it just encourages a very shallow form of discussion and way too much dismissal. And I think the way that genres evolve is by iteration. It's by people making games within the same genre and inspiring each other. And maybe they come up with a really cool, awesome new mechanic. And then other games adopt it and they're better for it. And that's wonderful. So I'd like to get rid of that. If we get rid of problematic, that would be pretty cool. Again, a very overused word. I used to like that word. That was a perfectly good word. And then people took it to mean, it's a very vague word. That's the main problem with it. I think that you can criticize a game as much as you can in any other media on many different levels, whether it be purely mechanical level, whether it be a very consumer-oriented level, whether it be a social level, whether it be an artistic level. You can say whatever you want about a game. You know, it's a video game. It doesn't have feelings. It's not going to get upset. But when you throw out a word like that, I feel like it's just you don't really have a case. You're probably just saying, well, I have some vague moral issue with it, and I'm just going to put it in this box over here that says that there's something wrong with it. It's insidious. It reminds me of the way that they used to treat Mortal Kombat in the 90s when there were Senate hearings about things like Night Trap and things like that. You know, we were talking about what's going to happen to the children. Well, I mean, a lot of us grew up with that, and the answer is bloody nothing. Nothing happened. Yep. Absolutely nothing happened. I mean, nobody played Night Trap, for God's sake. But it's a word that I feel is like very poisonous to discussion, and I think that if you're going to use it, you better have a damn good reason for coming up with something like that. And yeah, I'd love to see those go away. But I think more importantly, maybe than just words disappearing, I'd love for people to approach discussion online, not even just about games in general. Maybe this is a bit preachy, but approaching discussion online from a position of good faith, like assuming that maybe the other person on the end of the discussion isn't a horrible monster and isn't an awful human being and is not someone that you need to demonize or treat as an enemy. You know, maybe come to the table thinking that, you know, an exchange of views, even if you don't agree with them, is going to be a positive experience for both people, and maybe you're going to come out of it having learned something. You know, I think that more so than just throwing these words out of discussion, if we just fixed discussion in general online, then we wouldn't even have to worry about that.
All right, so we're going to do one more question. Cool. It's a fan question that I gathered from the internet.
All right, cool. I've got one fan. That's awesome.
You had lots, but we're time pressured. So if you guys want to start lining up for fan questions, we have 20 more minutes for that, and I'll let him answer this fan question. Sure. So if you had to order one thing for your cynical army to do, what would it be? Don't be my cynical army is what I would order them to do. That's my last and final decree. It will be written in my will. Don't be an army of anybody. It's obviously a very, very light-hearted question, but I think that on a more serious note, there is a great danger, especially online, with the rise of, kind of meteoric rise of people through almost random means, like the fact that we have things like YouTube and Twitter and Instagram that people have just blown up out of nowhere. You know, they've gained celebrity pretty much out of nowhere and have no idea what to do with it. You know, they've gained this immense amount of power that they can use, and unfortunately, some people don't use it for good things. And I think that the idea of there being a fandom that would, that would refer to themselves as an army or anything along those lines is inherently quite a dangerous thing, because it encourages mob mentality. Right. It encourages looking at someone who's perhaps critical of somebody and attacking them en masse, because you feel like, you've got to defend this person you like.
There's the famous phrase, which I think rings true, is like, never meet your idols. And I think to expand on that, never treat anybody as an idol in the first place, because you'll gain unrealistic expectations, and you're giving that person an awful lot of power over you, whereas they don't really know sort of who you are, they don't know you on a personal level, and yet you're giving them power over your personal life. And it's really important as a person not to define yourself by the things that you own, the people that you enjoy watching, the media that you enjoy. There's nothing wrong with being a fan of something. There's nothing wrong with being enthusiastic about something. Just don't let it take you over as a person. Don't let yourself be defined by somebody else, I think is what I'd say to that. So don't become part of somebody's army or whatever, just keep things at arm's length,
Nicely said. So before we start the fan questions, I just want to remind you to be respectful and...
Mostly.
So keep your questions to one sentence, please, and we will alternate from there to there, back and forth. So we'll start with you.
Hi, how's it going?
Hi, pretty good.
Good to hear. I'll try to keep this short. I apologize. It's a bit of a complex question. There's a lot of very anti-consumer practices within the games industry, and EA can be a very great example of some of those. How do you see those companies panning out if they don't change their practices? Do you see them sticking around? Do you see them eventually going out? Do you see them eventually caving in and being more consumer friendly? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think with EA in particular, it goes in cycles. EA has had its moments as being the devil of the games industry, and then it's had its moments of being second devil behind Activision in the games industry. And the thing is, they tend to stick around regardless of what they do, because they have control over some very popular licenses, whether it be sports licenses, whether it be really big games, and they tend to buy studios, get really great licenses, and then kill them. But unfortunately, before they do that, they usually get a couple of games out of them. And those games are games that we as core gamers often enjoy. Upcoming release, of course, Mirror's Edge Catalyst. A lot of us have been looking forward to a new Mirror's Edge game for ages. It's an incredible IP that we thought we'd never see the light of day of again. Will it end up being any good? That's a good question. But in buying that game, we're also supporting EA. And it's really hard not to do that. It's hard to push these practices out of the industry, because I think mass boycotts and things like that don't really work all that well, especially against a publisher like that, because we end up in a catch-22, because what we're saying is, as consumers, we want games like Mirror's Edge. We want original IP with really cool new characters. We want to see new kinds of gameplay, new kinds of characters, new kinds of protagonists. But in order to do that, we've got to give EA money.
Yeah.
That's just a bit of a problem, I think the only way that kind of thing stops is if we end up in a situation where making games somehow becomes a lot cheaper and studios can do it independently. And we've seen ways and means of doing that: crowdfunding, early access to some degree, which has limited success, the success of certain indie studios, independent funding, and investment. And all of those things can work, but I think that as long as big publishers continue to exist, and as long as games continue to get pre-ordered by the millions, there are always going to be certain anti-consumer practices. The only thing that people can really do is be very loud about that, and also put your money where your mouth is and say, look, maybe I just wait for your game to go on sale. Maybe I don't give you full price for this because I don't think you're playing fair.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey. So you've been in journalism for quite a long time now.
I'm not a journalist. But considering the definition of games journalism these days, I guess anybody can be.
All right,
so by all means.
Commentation then, something like that.
Yeah, let's go with that.
Did you find this was a path that you actively sought out beforehand, or did it kind of
fall in your lapses? I wanted to be a lawyer. See how well that went out. I went to university. I got my degree. And then suddenly discovered that the legal sector in the UK was shrinking and that nobody could get a job, so that wasn't fun. Then I wanted to be a radio DJ, mostly for metal. Turns out not a huge market for that. I wish there were. I don't make a great career out of that. But I think that it is really something I just fell into. And the formats that I use now and what I do now is just something that I kind of acquired over time through trial and error. I've tried a lot of different formats that just haven't worked. And I don't think that every format is destined to work properly. I don't think that there is ever going to be a situation where everything you do turns to gold. But it is a case of finding out what people liked, finding out, is there a niche in this market somewhere that I can fill, and then filling it. And what's ridiculous about this, coming to your point when it comes to games journalism, is that why exactly is there a niche for people who do consumer-oriented critique? Shouldn't that be everybody? I mean, isn't that the point? I remember reading games magazines when I was a lot younger, and that's all they wrote about. You know, they wrote about the game. It's like, how much is this game worth the money? Is this game worth the buy? You know, that was the priority, serving the consumer. And some people might say it's cool that games journalism or commentary or punditry has expanded beyond that, but simultaneously, I think we're in a time where games are very expensive. There are a lot of them out there, and we need people to sift through them and try and find the good ones. So I fell into this. I consider myself very lucky and fortunate every day that I get to do this job, and very thankful to everybody in this room and everybody beyond this room that lets me continue to do that job.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Testing, testing.
It works.
Before I ask you my question, I was going to give you City of Music because I know you like a lot of video game music. Is it possible I can give it to you tomorrow at the other panel you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. No problem.
So here's my question. So I love UTB a lot, and I see most of your videos because YouTube has a setting where you can make the videos faster, and I cheat by doing that.
Yeah, a lot of people do that because I talk way too freaking much. I don't know if you noticed that.
So yeah, but I've been hearing you for the past 2 years, and my question is, I know you have a thing with frame rate, and I understand that now. I'm able to see that because when I was a kid, I know short questions. I played games at 30 frames per second, and now I'm playing 60. But it's like, you always complain about frame rate, which I understand, and a lot of good games I play are 30 frames locked. Is there ever a time you wish you can like turn your Switch off or just enjoy
all the time?
Yeah.
All the damn time. I own all the consoles, and I don't play them outside of maybe the Wii U, because that has some fun games on it, like just the games that were just built from the core to be fun. I wish I could turn that off because I'd like to play Uncharted 4, but as soon as I tried to handle that thing, it's like, God, this is like moving through treacle. I wanted to play Hyper Light Drifter recently on PC, and I was actually back down Kickstarter. I'm super disappointed to find out that it ran at 30 because I've got to the point where I played so many games that I've become way too sensitive to that, And I almost wish I could rewind time 10 years when I didn't know that, and play all of those games again and not be so bothered by it. As cool as it is to sort of realize how awesome gaming at really high frame rate is, simultaneously it's a bit of a curse to I think anyone that does realize it, because it limits the amount of games they can play, and who the hell wants to be limited on what games they can play, right? I absolutely wish I could forget what that felt like. That would be awesome.
But thank you. Just where, like you said earlier, where the game has to be fun. Like I don't care about the frame, unless it's like below 20. As long as it's fun for me, I don't mind.
Yeah, the problem is the frame rate affects the fun, as it were. I was talking earlier about the core gameplay loop as the question that I was asked there, and that is affected by things like frame rate. Because it's how quickly your input, your input gets into the machine itself. You're interfacing with the game, and if you can't interface with the game very well, it's like I'm trying to make a sports analogy and realizing I'm a nerd and I can't do that. But it limits your ability to enjoy and fully experience and get immersed in the game. So it's a problem.
Thank you, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
I have a very simple question. How does this room compare to the one you had at Dragon Con?
Bigger. So for those who don't know, we went to Dragon Con for the first year. We brought the Co-optional podcast, Jesse and Dodger, to... which they should have been here, but they're lazy and they never showed up. It's their fault. Actually, they had no intention of being here, but they will hopefully come to Dragon Con again at some point. But Dragon Con obviously has been around for a long time, and it's crazy and huge and scary and terrifying. And we got a room that consisted of 50 seats. And we filled... we have our own convention in the UK now called CoxCon, which is now in its second year. How that ended up happening, I don't know. But last year we sold 1,000 tickets and we put 1,000 people in a room for that. So they gave us 50, obviously. That's the logical number. It didn't work out so well. It was a little small room. Obviously we're grateful to any convention that will host us blithering for an hour. But the problem we had with it was that quite literally hundreds of people got stuck outside the room. and were disappointed and weren't able to come in. And that, I think when anybody shows up to see you, like they go out of your way to see you at a live event, the absolute least you can do is try and meet them, give them a show or whatever. And if you can't do that, it's really disappointing to us, and we feel really bad about it. So this room's pretty cool. Way too big for someone like me. Way too big. But it's awesome that we've got this space. So there you go.
Thank you.
No worries. Hi.
Hey. With MOBAs being extremely popular, and there being a lot of spin-offs from League of Legends and Dota, and then Smite and all the small ones, and now the new genre of hero shooters. What's your opinion on that?
It's weird to call it a genre, I guess, but I don't blame people for doing that because they're trying to find a sort of catch-all term that will cover games like Overwatch and Paladins, and Paragon slips in there as well, even though it really isn't. Like, if anyone's played Paragon yet, they'll probably realize it's certainly more of a, it's more Smite-ish than it is anything else. It's not really a shooter per se, but you're always going to have these issues when a kind of glut of games that share some similarities in mechanics come along that people need to find a name for them. I think that it's really just more of a revival of what Team Fortress 2 started, almost 10 years ago. Or it's a situation where people's like, right, it's okay. People have forgotten about TF2 now. We can go and copy them now. We can do something inspired by that. I think that it makes sense because of what you mentioned earlier. These games have MOBA or Dota style or whatever you want to call them inspirations. The idea of they're team-based games, you've got abilities on cooldowns, you've got an ultimate, maybe you have a resource system, and people figured out, well, people love that. These games are incredibly popular, but we can't compete in the same arena as League of Legends and Dota because that's suicide, as everybody has tried to do and basically failed unless your name is Smite. And everyone else is just flopped, and people keep making these games and they keep failing over and over and over again. So they realized, okay, well, let's try and take an element that people like and put it in another genre, and let's try and get away with it that way. And I like them. I think they're fun. Overwatch is great. I love Battleborn as well. Paladins could use some work, but it's got some, maybe has some potential, certainly. I would like to see where people go with it. Lawbreakers is actually really cool. As I played at PAX, it's really enjoyable. So, yeah, I mean, we get these trends every now and again, these pseudo-genres within the games industry where a bunch of people try and jump on the bandwagon, but I like this particular bandwagon, so hopefully it sticks around for a while.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks.
Hello.
Hello.
Since you were a big Warcraft fan, do you think the new movie's going to be good or not?
I mean, I've been avoiding the reviews because of potential spoilers. I mean, I'll be honest, I don't think I've even seen one of the trailers. I'm sick of watching trailers because they ruin everything these days. I don't know what's going on with that. They need to stop that. Yeah, but it's a video game movie. The odds aren't good. Like, the only good video game movie was Mortal Kombat. Yeah. The only one. And that was because it embraced the cheese. In a real way. It didn't try and be serious. The Warcraft movie does not appear to be embracing any form of cheese. It looks like it's actually trying to be taken seriously. And I think that what's worrying about it is that they seem to be making it in a way that's very accessible to audiences that don't play Warcraft and have never played WoW or anything like that. The problem with doing that is that you alienate the people that really loved your franchise to begin with. I think they're rolling the dice on saying, well, if you like the franchise, you're going to go see it anyway, no matter how bad it is, right? Probably, but I don't hold out many hopes. I mean, it's probably going to be a fairly generic fantasy action movie thingy. I actually wish it stuck more to the story or something along those lines, because I think maybe Blizzard is one of the only people that has the clout to do that, but yeah, I don't hold out many hopes. I still think the best video game movie ever made wasn't even a video game movie, and that was Scott Pilgrim versus the World. That was the best video game movie because it wasn't a video game movie, but it could have been, for all intents and purposes. It understood what people that enjoy video games and comics and really dig, and as a result, it was an awesome movie. This, I'm not holding out too much hope. I'm going to be honest. I hope it's good. It's probably not going to be great. Oh, God. All right, thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Just referencing that, the Angry Birds movie was better than it deserved to be.
Really? I will take your word for that.
All right, but I do have 2 really quick questions.
Okay.
Is there any YouTuber that you have not collabed with that you would really like to?
I mean, I don't know if you count him as a YouTuber, but obviously Yahtzee is someone I have collabed with before once. We did a panel at the now defunct Escapist Expo with me, Jim Sterling, and Yahtzee in the same room, which was hilarious. At least it was for me anyway. I don't think anyone else was laughing, but I found it hilarious, mostly just because I like to be around those guys. I know he said he wants to be on the podcast, so that's going to happen, hopefully. So that's great. Is there anybody else that we kind of haven't had a chance to collab with yet? That's a tricky one. It's always weird because I think a lot of the guys that I watch are not gaming YouTubers. So it's like, hey, come on the podcast and talk about games, Overwatch for 3 hours. And they're like, why would I want to do that? I was like, you have a point, actually. But the thing is, Xavier Woods is a more hardcore gamer than I am. You know, I don't know how he manages that. It's like, how do you do all of these things? Like, do you not feel bad for that? Like, you're making everyone else feel awful by comparison. Can you stop that? But yeah, I mean, that is probably Yahtzee, honestly. I know it's kind of a boring answer, but I think a lot of the other people, they're not even like gaming YouTubers or whatever, so, you know, it's like I would like to collab with the guy from ForgottenWeapons.com, and we could talk about obscure pinfire pistols from the 1800s or something. Maybe not. But yeah, thanks for your question.
Just to be fair, let's keep it to 1 question so that we can move on. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, we are unfortunately rapidly running out of time. So,
Yes.
If you were a Hearthstone card, what would you be and do?
I'd be the Annoyatron, most likely. You don't understand. He's not actively annoying. He's not actively anything. What's a card that does nothing? He's the Ancient Watcher. Can't attack, just kind of sits there. Doesn't really do anything. A dummy, maybe, yeah. Yes, there you go, Annoyatron. That's your quick answer. Awesome.
What is your opinion on gaming on Windows 10 and console to PC porting of games and vice versa?
Gaming on Windows 10. I just rolled back Windows 10. Windows 10 is like a virus. Windows 10 is really hard to get rid of. Trust me, once you've got it, it's very, very hard to get rid of. It got to the point where I pulled the SSD out of the machine because I could not figure out another way of getting rid of the damn thing, and then tried over and over and over again to make a Windows 7 bootable again. In theory, Windows 10 will be fine for gaming when everything works properly, and obviously a lot of people are going to have to adopt it for DirectX 12. It's kind of the way that things are going. But I never really liked the idea of being locked to a particular operating system in order to play games. I've never liked that idea. It would be great if we didn't have to worry about that. But Microsoft is shoving certain things down people's throats when it comes to Windows 10 exclusive gaming. DirectX 12 is starting to gain momentum, and unless an API like Vulkan takes over and actually becomes the de facto API, which I kind of hope that it does, so that Microsoft doesn't have control of it, then it's not a great experience. I know, the Windows Store is a disaster. I don't know if you've used it, it's awful. It's just awful. You know, the UWP and things like that are very restrictive, and I could spend hours on this. I don't have the time to do so, but I will just say that my experience with Windows 10 up to this point has not been a positive one, and I don't intend to go back to it anytime soon.
Okay.
All right, that's all the time we have for questions. Are there any final words you'd like to say, things to expect from your channel?
Videos at some point, no doubt. Big thanks to everyone for coming out. I'd just like to let people know that I believe I will be doing a couple of signing sessions and meet and greets. There's going to be one at 3 p.m., I believe, today, according to... Is it 3 p.m.? Where is that? Couldn't tell you. I think it's... Don't they do that in the main theater kind of autograph place? Something like that. Not the best at navigation, as you probably know. But I am doing another panel tomorrow at 10 a.m., which is called YouTube Passion to Profession, or something along those lines. I'm going to be doing that with Mathis, who is hanging out at the back there, who you may know from the Northern Lion Scum Show. And I'm also going to be doing a online personality panel, whatever that means, on the main stage. Saturday, 1 p.m. is that one, and there'll be another signing session for those who don't get the chance at 6:30, I believe, 6:30 to 7:30 in the autograph area, wherever that might be. So if you do want to show up for that, then that would be phenomenal. Thank you very much for showing up.
Awesome.
And thanks for such a warm reception. Never been to MomoCon before. I'd love to come again. It's been awesome so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.